So, sleeping. Let's be honest, we've all done it. Characters in our favourite media have done it too, even when they're in spaceships. We're looking at the naval inspirations that tie right back into these fictional space beds, as well as seeing how they stack up to what real astronauts sleep in on today's Spacedock. Before we get into the main topic, I just want to quickly announce that we will be doing a Patreon exclusive question and answer thing at the end of this month, January 2026. Subscribe now at the lowest tier to ask what you want of any of us on the Spacedock team before the 28th, and we'll publish the answers shortly after that. We're looking forward to seeing what you want to know, but this is a new thing we're trying out here, so bear with us while we figure it all out. And now on with the main topic, and as I said in the intro, we can't talk about spaceships without talking about non-spaceships. The fictional former very often takes its cues from the real latter, and where people sleep is no exception, as we can see from the bunk beds on the Cerritos in lower decks. These spaces that are just directly on a hallway are like a luxury version of the sorts of things enlisted personnel get aboard naval vessels. I say luxury because they're actually quite big, relatively speaking, especially compared to the incredibly densely packed bunks that used to be aboard naval vessels in the first half of the 19th century. Imagine hot bunking one of these, which may also be directly in the space you work in. And this is relevant for space stuff too, I swear. Remember this for later. That sardine packing happened because back then, ships required an awful lot of manual labour to function, or they might have been carrying troops or marines. Combine that with how those people might not even be there by choice, and you can see why the sleeping arrangements are so sparsan. This changed a bit when navies switched to being filled with those who volunteered rather than those who were drafted, or worse. At least then they got a privacy curtain. That's something that seems to be lacking on the Cerritos bunks, and the ones on the Normandy, though at least I think Galactica might have had them. Another thing to consider with bunks like this is that how tightly they're packed in is also dependent on the size of the ship. Things could be tight on a huge battleship, but even on a modern submarine, the beds get pretty squished in. This is a good analogy for certain styles of spacecraft though, since those have the exact same volume limitations for basically the same reason, just the other way around. They're both pressure vessels. One keeps the water out, the other keeps the air in, and optimizing the size of them just makes sense. There's a bit of an interesting twist on bunks in The Fifth Element, where the interior of the passenger space jet thing that goes to Floston Paradise is laid out like a capsule hotel. Here, the density for sleeping spaces is to fit in more passengers per flight, but really if you think about it, there's far more volume in these pods than what you get on a modern day passenger jet. To be fair though, I can't recall what level of ticket Bruce Willis had, maybe he got more space than economy does. Also, the rollers here to assist with getting in and out of the pods seem fun, but boy, I can't imagine them being comfortable. Stepping up from stuffing crew in bunks wherever they fit is stuffing officers in bunks in tiny rooms. At least they get extra stuff to assist with their duties like a desk or a sink, maybe even a door. Star Trek is once again a great example of rooms like this, from tiny little spaces aboard the Defiant, because it's a little ship, to the shared quarters that Boimler and Rutherford get aboard Cerritos. A notable thing here is that their quarters, while of a decent size, are in a less than ideal position since they get blasted with the light from the nacelles. Overall, I feel like this type of room is generally the default that we tend to see in sci-fi. Yes, there's bunks a lot of the time as well, but I don't know, it just seems like individual rooms are more prevalent. Like in The Expanse, where the Rocinante has pretty big quarters for everyone, and while yeah, it may show that Mars can afford to treat its people better, it's also a bit of a function of the type of story being told. The crew do end up living on the ship after all, so it needs to feel a little more homey and nice because of that. It doesn't go as far as Serenity goes with that though, but there's also a tonal difference between the shows there. Also, there's the out-of-universe reasons for the quarters of the Roci to be so big, since they gotta fit a camera crew in there as well. At the top of the pile for beds and quarters is of course what the senior officers get. The increase in responsibility naturally comes with an increase in space, and probably a gigantic bed as well. While we have BSG on screen, there's an interesting thing where the rooms are still around about what you'd expect on a real-life naval vessel in terms of size, which makes sense, that's the inspiration and vibe the show is going for, but I feel like it almost clashes with how insanely huge Galactica actually is. Anyway, that's all the Space Navy stuff out the way. What happens in real life? How does that differ with the added complication of being in constant freefall? Quite a bit, really. For one, you obviously can't have a regular bed with a mattress and sheets. That just doesn't make sense. You'd float away from a mattress, and the sheets would float away from you. Instead, sleeping bags are what's used, though these two will also float around, astronaut included. So the bags are strapped down, which makes pictures of sleeping astronauts look very peculiar. But hey, that's what you gotta do to stop from drifting around and bumping into stuff and maybe waking up. A thing to note here, notice the pose that sleeping astronauts end up in. This is called the neutral body posture and is the shape the body forms when it's completely relaxed and has no forces acting upon it. There's a little variation from person to person, but generally they're pretty similar. Just something to bear in mind for a zero-G sleeping space, since a sleeper's arms are gonna stick out. Another consideration is that you must sleep in a very well ventilated area, with a breeze on your face to stop you from suffocating. Being in freefall means there's no buoyancy or normal airflow, so exhaled carbon dioxide just doesn't go anywhere. It settles right where it gets breathed out, blocking fresh air and all its lovely life-giving oxygen, unless an external force like a fan pointed at your face blows it away. The body's circadian rhythm is yet another concern. We evolved to live around the day-night cycle, and so living in constant artificial light can mess up our sleep cycles. This can already be bad enough down here. Now imagine what it's like on the ISS, where they see several sunsets and sunrises every single day, so they have zero natural reference point to sleep around. This is one of the reasons the ISS has individual sleeping cabinets. These are basically just well-ventilated cupboards with sleeping bags in, but at least they have doors or curtains to block out exterior light. Plus, they're the only private space the astronauts get. Remember those tiny bunks in workspaces from earlier? See, I told you it was relevant. These sleeping cabinets aren't much different when you think about it, though maybe they're somewhere between the bunks and the tiny officers' quarters. And so, because of all the challenges faced by astronauts trying to sleep in space, research shows that the amount and quality of sleep they get is worse than down here. But this doesn't necessarily mean that all sleep everywhere in space is going to be worse than in freefall on a working research station stuffed with computers and machines that are all running all the time. But it is an indication that it might be. At the end of things, how and where people sleep on a spacecraft depends on a number of factors. A big one is whether there's some source of gravity, since the absence of it introduces a bunch of challenges to overcome. Beyond that, there's the spacecraft itself, what type of ship it is, its size, how many crew it needs to function, and their ranks. A modifier to that is how well treated the crew are, which ties into the tech level of the setting as well as the culture of whoever operates the vessel. Another factor I've not brought up till now is how long a craft is meant to be away from port. If it's intended to only go out on short missions, then the sleeping spaces are going to be an afterthought compared to a ship that's meant to go out for weeks, months, or even years. Alternatively, just raw dog it like Mando does in his N1 seat. You can support Spacedock by joining our Patreon, where you can get our frigate, fighter and carrier design reference books, as well as 1 week early access to upcoming videos. Thanks to our supporters, and thank you for watching.